Now, in the 1970s, you are going to see a rise in conservatism in the country, right? Conservatives are going to be dominating the federal government, okay? So in the 70s, you're going to see the rise of conservative think tanks, like, for example, the Heritage Foundation. And they worked to promote the ideas of neoconservatives, right? The new conservatives. Their ideas included criticism of social programs such as welfare, which they claimed made people not want to work, which hurt the economy, right? So you see how there's a reaction to the recessions of the 1970s and the early 80s, the economic recessions. And so there, because the economy is not doing well, you have conservatives or neoconservatives blaming welfare, okay, or other social programs. So basically, neoconservatives wanted to cut government spending to such programs. They also wanted tax cuts for the wealthy. Okay, and why? They're claiming that the wealthy would use their extra money to invest more in business, which would help the economy. Okay, tax cuts would also decrease the amount of revenue going to the government, which means less money for social programs to help the poor. In California, conservatives successfully eliminated any type of increase in property taxes with the passing of Prop 13. But this cut funding for the school system because the school system got its funding from property taxes. Okay, so Prop 13 is helping homeowners, but it's hurting the school system. Okay, so a lack of funding for the school system. Conservatives also argued that deregulation, okay, deregulation meaning less intervention from the government in the economy, would help businesses because they wouldn't have to spend so much money in order to meet government regulations, okay, and that would eventually equal more profits for those businesses. An example of government regulation was the Clean Air Act, which created strong environmental regulations. Okay, conservatives involved in the exploitation of natural resources, such as mining companies, ranching companies, they joined a movement known as the Sagebrush Rebellion. Okay, and the Sagebrush Rebellion was calling for less environmental regulations or a complete termination of all environmental regulations. So you see the Sagebrush Rebellion as yet another example of conservatives trying to lessen or eliminate government regulations so that they can make more profits. In the late 1970s, early 1980s, you also see the rise of the religious right. Okay, some conservatives were highly critical of the Supreme Court's decision that protected the right to have an abortion because they oppose abortion on religious grounds. Okay, and so they support what is called the pro-life movement. Pro-life movement. So the pro-life movement sought to overturn the Roe versus Wade decision. Okay, this is the religious right. The religious right also strongly opposed the sex revolution and gay liberation movements as they claimed that they weakened the American family or American family values. You have evangelical preachers such as Jerry Falwell. They got political, okay? They got politically involved by endorsing conservative candidates who supported their political views, okay? So now you start to have the religious right getting involved in politics, okay? Supporting specific candidates who were against abortion, right? Or who supported American family values, okay? Now, going back to the economy, so President Jimmy Carter, he was not able to get the U.S. out of this period of stagflation, right? Where there was stagnant economic growth and increased inflation. okay? And so his failure in ending stagflation led to the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, okay? So President Carter's out, Ronald Reagan is the new president. Now, Reagan supported many of the conservative ideals that we have spoken about, right? He's anti-abortion, anti-civil rights, right? Anti-government spending on social programs, lower taxes for the rich, deregulation, right? So the government's not regulating businesses, smaller government, right? He wants a smaller federal government, and Christian morality, right? So the religious right. So Reagan is supporting many of these conservative ideals. Now, Reagan's economic policy, which is known as supply side economics or trickle down economics from the people who opposed it, this economic policy, supply side economics, this involved cutting taxes for the wealthy, right? With rates eventually dropping from 70%, right? Because it was once 70% tax rate for the rich. Those rates are going to drop to 28% by his second term. Okay, so that's a dramatic decrease in tax rates for the wealthy. Cutting taxes in general was supposed to make all Americans, quote unquote, work harder. Okay, whatever that's supposed to mean. I guess you get a second job so that you can make more money because you're paying less taxes, maybe, or something like that, right? You're working harder, you're working more hours, and so since you're paying less taxes, you're motivated to work harder, right? The period of supply side economics is known as Reaganomics, okay? Reaganomics is because of Reagan's economic policy. Okay, so the period of Reaganomics eventually did help companies become more profitable because they're paying less taxes, right? They're not hiring as many people, especially in manufacturing jobs. They're opening factories outside of the country, right? Which is allowing them to pay less for labor, right? Because wages are lower in other countries. And so this had an impact on minority workers who had recently got more job opportunities due to affirmative action, right? So we had affirmative action where employers are supposed to have a quota where they hire a certain number of people from various minority groups or ethnicities, right? And so people were getting more high-paying jobs in the manufacturing sectors, but now they lost these high-paying jobs because companies are outsourcing these jobs to other countries, okay? And so this is a major blow to one of the main goals of the civil rights movement, right? And that goal was economic equality. That's what affirmative action is all about, to try to bring economic equality for various minority groups, right? Make more money, be on equal terms with Anglo-Americans, economic equality, all right? And so Reaganomics is hurting economic equality because companies are now moving their factories to other countries where they could pay less for labor and they could make more of a profit, okay? Meanwhile, more Americans are now working in the service sector, or they're working in retail, right? Same thing. And they're getting paid much less, with less benefits, if any benefits at all. So Reaganomics, it's good for businesses, but not good for workers. And businesses began to crack down on unions during this time, which led to a decrease in union membership. So the rich get richer and the poor do not, okay? But unemployment and inflation did decrease during Reagan's second term, okay? So he has some success there trying to combat stagflation. But did the wealthy use their extra profits from the tax cuts to invest in business? Not so much, okay? Didn't do it. Remember, that's what the tax cuts were for, so that these businesses would have more revenue and then they would reinvest back into their businesses. That didn't happen, okay? What did they do with that extra money from the tax cuts? They bought stuff, okay? They bought real estate, they bought cars, they bought boats. They're having a good time. In terms of government spending, Reagan did not make huge cuts when it came to military spending, okay? In fact, military spending increased so greatly that the United States found itself in a $2.7 trillion debt, okay? You can't just spend huge amounts of money on the military and then lower taxes dramatically. Why? Because there's not enough income to pay for that government spending. Because the government gets its income from taxes, right? So you lower taxes, you're not getting as much taxes, but yet you're spending all of this money on the military, okay? That's going to increase the debt. $2.7 trillion. Oh my. Reagan also intensified the Cold War through anti-Soviet rhetoric, okay? It's calling the Soviet Union an evil empire, okay? And that's what the military spending was for, right? A resumption of the arms race, okay? Resuming the arms race. And that's why they're spending so much on the military. Now, during the 1980s, young stockbrokers, financial advisors, and others in the financial sector, they're known as yuppies, they got rich off of corporate buyouts. Okay, so what's that? Basically, one large corporation would buy another corporation, they merge together, and all of these financial workers involved in the buyout get a huge paycheck. Okay, but the workers in those companies often lost their jobs as factories were relocated elsewhere, right? Either to another region in the United States or outside of the country. All right, so corporate buyouts, not so good for the workers, but great for the quote unquote yuppies, okay? The young stockbrokers, the young financial advisors, getting rich in the 1980s. Now, another aspect of Reagan's administration was his war on drugs, right? The war on drugs. And part of the war on drugs was the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which was passed by Congress in 1986. Now, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act led to a major increase in prison populations, right? As the possession of drugs, just the possession of drugs, now came with a mandatory minimum sentence, okay? And it depended on which type of drug you had, how much of the drug, whatever. But this is all happening during the time of the crack epidemic, okay? A number of people are getting addicted to crack. And so if you're caught with even a small amount of crack, you get 5 years in jail. That's the mandatory minimum sentence for just a small amount of crack, okay? And so the amount of people in prison rose by the hundreds of thousands. And most of these inmates are African Americans and Mexican Americans, all right? So minority groups are being heavily impacted by the war on drugs. And we're not just talking about selling drugs, we're talking about just possessing drugs, okay? That's coming with a mandatory minimum sentence, okay? Now, President Nixon actually had started this whole process when he had pushed for an expansion of the prison system in the 1970s. So Nixon was pushing to have more prisons built, okay? So more prisons were built in the 1970s, and then Reagan's war on drugs is going to help to fill those prisons with people of color, just for the mere possession of drugs, okay? So you have people, spending years in jail just for possessing drugs. And so the war on drugs is very controversial because it's really negatively impacting minority communities. Now, the Reagan administration would come under fire when it became publicly known that President Reagan had authorized the sale of weapons to Iran. Okay, Iran, which had been under a dictatorship, the dictatorship of the Shah of Iran, had been an ally to the United States, and it was a source of oil imports. But when the Shah of Iran was an ally of the US, when he was overthrown in an Islamic revolution led by the Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979, Iran became an enemy to the United States because the Ayatollah Khomeini had denounced the US for their support of the Shah of Iran. Okay, so even though Iran was considered an enemy state, the Reagan administration was involved in selling weapons to Iran. What? I thought President Reagan was, a cold warrior, hardcore cold warrior. Why is his administration involved in selling weapons to Iran? Well, American citizens had been captured by the Islamic militant organization Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is in Lebanon. Okay, so you have some Americans being captured by Hezbollah in Lebanon, and President Reagan, he had hoped that the sale of weapons to Iran would convince Iran to help negotiate for the release of those captives in Lebanon. Okay, but the thing was, it was illegal at that time to sell weapons to Iran. Okay, there was a ban on selling weapons to Iran, and so President Reagan or his administration was breaking the law. Okay, not supposed to be selling weapons to Iran, even if you're trying to get American captives released in Lebanon. And to make things worse, the Reagan administration, in conjunction with the CIA, was using part of the funds from those weapon sales to Iran, right? They're using part of those funds to fund a group of insurgents in Nicaragua known as the Contras, okay? The Contras. Now, why? Why is the Reagan administration using these funds to help support the Contras in Nicaragua? Because the Reagan administration wanted the Contras to overthrow the socialist government in Nicaragua, which was ran by a group known as the Sandinistas. Okay, so it's a Cold War strategy. Okay, they're a socialist government in Nicaragua, the Sandinistas, and so Reagan wants to have them overthrown. So he's funneling money, right, or his administration is funneling money to this group called the Contras, who are, hopefully from Reagan's perspective, going to overthrow the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. Okay, basically he doesn't want another socialist government in Latin America, in the Western Hemisphere. And also the Sandinistas had recently overthrown a longtime dictator and American ally in Nicaragua, a man by the name of Anastasio Somoza. Okay, and so, Somoza, he used to be in control of Nicaragua for a long period of time. He was a dictator. A lot of people were oppressed under his rule, but he was overthrown by the Sandinistas. And now the Reagan administration wants to get the Sandinistas out of power. And so they're funding this insurgent group called the Contras. And that funding is coming partially from the weapon sales to Iran. Okay, so very controversial stuff. Reagan wants the Sandinistas taken out, and so why not have the CIA fund the Contras? Okay, anyway, so all of this gets revealed to the American public, right? And President Reagan, he claims he didn't know anything about it, right? But 11 people within his administration would end up going to jail for the Iran-Contra affair, okay? And ultimately, the incident will hurt the legacy of Ronald Reagan.